I love seeing so many familiar faces and new faces. And thanks, Josh. Thank you for having me on here. This is a sneak peek, you guys. It's going to launch in Quantum Narratives. The book is going to launch in a couple of weeks at South by Southwest. If you'll be in Austin, I'll be talking and doing a book signing on March 11th. This actually was a chapter in my previous book called The End of Storytelling. If anybody's familiar with that, it was very much saying, hey, the world of interactive and immersive is a different space. We need to shift our mindset. But quantum narratives as a concept was a little bit too deep for that. So I pulled that chapter out and so I could expand on it into this. This y'all, is the first public presentation of this. It's the first time after decades of my mind warping around all of this that I'm actually speaking to somebody and showing you. So let's dive in and let's go back to those decades, the very beginning, where I started thinking about this idea of narrative paradox. I was studying both theater and computer science. And as you learned very quickly, on one side of the spectrum, you have story and all of its power and all of its meaning and how effective it is. And on the other end of the side, you have agency, right? So when we're popping on our virtual reality headsets in the 90s and you're able to interact and navigate, these two things are at odds. And around 2000, this got coined as a term called the narrative paradox. If you're not familiar with that, basically it's a tension between a structured, authored story and an audience's sense of agency. It's something that in the gaming community we struggle with all the time. You even see it, as Josh and I were talking about Sleep No More, where you go in for a theatrical experience, and because you're wandering around the space and you have this agency to interact, there is no linear story. It's more of a thematic spectacle than it is a well-constructed plot. And there are a lot of people since the 2000s, the last quarter century, a lot of fields have been exploring what this how to resolve the narrative paradox. Many creators, researchers, developers, and lots of different fields have tackled the narrative paradox, and they haven't been able to resolve it. And you got to ask why, right? What are some of the assumptions that we have that are keeping us from understanding how to resolve this? And I'll start on the story side. Those of you who are traditional storytellers, I call it classical storytellers, you'll probably recognize this structure. Familiar, right? Freytag's pyramid, where we have our 5 sequence of drama. So starting exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, denouement. This is obviously Western. It has evolved into the 3-act structure, the hero's journey, essentially crisis and catharsis, working to create a wonderful or meaningful story experience, right? All of these plot structures on the Western side are these sequences of events. They keep sticking with us because they work, right? They work. They've worked in film and theater and books, and they are rooted actually going even farther back than the 1800s, going back to Aristotle. And if you've studied classical theater, you know that he wrote this treatise called Poetics, right? And in Poetics, he's got this, for him, plot is the soul of the story. And plot and character combine to create a meaningful experience so that you can have catharsis, which is he viewed as the ultimate purpose for drama. So those of you who know Poetics, are you also familiar with the treatise that he wrote on physics? It's called Physics. And I think like right now we can agree Poetics, plot and character are in today's world more dominant than the other things he talked about, which are like spectacle, diction, theme, other elements that combine to create good drama. And physics, he was exploring what the principles were that governed the natural world. And these are things like teleology, right? Like the purpose of fire is to go up to reach the heavens. The purpose of the stone falling to the ground is so that it can reach the center of the universe. Okay, how many of you guys agree with this? Right? How many of you guys agree that the earth is the center of the universe and everything revolves around the earth? So we have there over here in poetics, nothing has happened. We're still using these old frameworks. In physics, you see this momentum, this questioning, these studies and measurements, and we move beyond Aristotelian physics. We move through a series, very oversimplifying this, into our classical physics of Newton's, which we know like the laws of motion, cause and effect, things like that. So here we have what I call the Aristotelian limp. We've progressed in one area, and the other area is very much held by the chains of classical thought. So what happens and what tends to happen as we see things progress in science or in the world, and as our tools improve, old theories don't tend to align with new information. And what we end up with are catastrophes, right? These are literally called catastrophes in the world of physics, right? In the world of physics, you have things like black body radiation, double slit experiment, like things where the old universe the rules don't work anymore. Once our tools open us up to different information, in this case, classical, we're looking at the world of the visible, and as we get better and better at looking at the subatomic world, things aren't behaving the way that they're supposed to. And I propose that this is not different than catastrophes that we have in the narrative space. Whoa, hey. On the narrative space, that jumped for me. Here we go. We have things that are causing catastrophes in classical narratives, things like interactivity, that agency we were looking at, which is supported with dynamic content, content that appears not necessarily in a linear order, but relative to the person who's engaging with it. And spatial storytelling, certainly like Sleep No More. And we aren't able to maintain our narrative cohesion because of these catastrophes. And it turns our world upside down. And it doesn't work because they're fundamentally opposed to the nature of story as we know this. So let's look at how science starts grappling with the catastrophes, and the world is turned upside down, and they go, we need new reasons, we need new models, we need new answers. And I will broadly oversimplify this by saying the field of quantum physics emerges. Quantum physics is incredibly complex. It's confounding, it's counterintuitive. I am not a quantum physicist, but I do take comfort in knowing that quantum physicists even say that they don't even understand it. But I think, like, let's skim the surface, guided by our current challenge, which is how do we resolve the narrative paradox so we can have interactive experiences, interactive stories, interactive dramas that maintain narrative cohesion and power while still allowing for, as much agency as possible from our guests. All right. So you have these two different things that are operating in two different worlds. We've got the classical world and the quantum world. But what ended up happening is, as soon as Apple's started, Apple still fell the same way in classical world, even when quantum came around, right? It wasn't like quantum came around and suddenly apples flew up into the sky, right? Like the natural world it's still the same. How they ended up resolving these two things is by saying that there is a domain difference, right? In the classical world, you're looking at the visible, the measurable. In the quantum world, you are looking at the invisible, the subatomic world. And these things operate differently in these two worlds. The one thing I would love to pull out at this point is that classical is deterministic and quantum is probabilistic, meaning in a classical world, every time I drop an apple, F equals ma, I will know what happens with that apple, the rate that it will fall. When you start going into the quantum world, everything is so small and operates completely differently that they consider it probabilistic, right? You don't know where something is located until you measure it. The distance over time can be overcome, and things, can affect things at great distance instantaneously without having to travel at the speed of light or anything like that. So crazy mind-bending ideas, but on the very high level, here you have classical, and if we take the word physics out of this, we have classical domain, which is predetermined, it is visible, it all works as we expect, and quantum is probabilistic and is the underpinnings. And the reason that they can combine and coexist is because classical is considered an approximation of quantum. So what that means is what we see is at such a high level that all the probabilities have been accounted for so that they can be measured and in a linear fashion, F equals ma. Whereas when you get into E equals mc squared and the quantum side of things, those are interchangeable. The reason that I think that this applies specifically on the story and specifically to Aristotle is when we look at theater, when we look at film, when we look at books and words on pages, those are approximations. Aristotle used the word mimesis, right? It is it is an imitation of life. It is not life itself, right? And likewise, classical is an approximation of everything that's happening at the very small scale, scaled up so that we can measure it, right? They work differently in their respective domains. They are separate domains that reflect each other on different scales. So whether we're talking about physics, whether we're talking about narrative, we have classical, which is our linear framed medium, and there is a place for that, and there are great stories. And then there is the quantum, which is probabilistic, which is interactive, which can use generative and dynamic content in a way, and we just need to figure out how to use it, right? But up till now, the way that we've been thinking about this is we're taking these two worlds and we're slapping on our Freytag's pyramid and we're saying square peg round hole, essentially. Like, this has got to work. It's a false paradigm. The classical structure is focusing on plot and character. All of those researchers that I showed you at the beginning, they're studying believable agents. They're studying branching narratives, right? They're layering in existing dominance of plot and character and saying, how do we make this work with interactivity? Instead of saying, maybe this is a completely different domain and maybe we need a completely different model and a new paradigm. But what would that be, right? Where do you even start? Okay, we broke everything. How do we fix it? Maybe we go back to these physicists. Maybe we go back to these scientists that have already spent centuries developing, researching, quantifying, measuring, bringing on theories, throwing them out the window. Why don't we start with that? Okay, so let's look at the fundamental foundations of physics, right? You've got forces like gravity that act and interact with things like matter, us, apples, whatever it is, and they exist within and affect space-time itself, which is calculated through fields. Sorry, little quick physicist thing. It'll be important later in just a second, but we also have energy and matter being interchangeable as part of, and I'm using the quantum model here rather than separating out time and space because that actually is relevant when we get into interactivity. But the key part of all of these elements is that it isn't linear and static like a predetermined equation, like a Freytag's pyramid. All of these things work together interchangeably in real time based on the properties that they have, right? Hopefully I haven't totally lost everybody, but I think what is important is that we move out of that and say, maybe this is a structure. And this is what I get into quantum narratives is how do the things that work in physics relate to the elements that are that have been identified through classical theory, through gaming theory, through neurology and say, how can we create an ecosystem that can support interactivity and story and narrative. And one of these key things, we don't have time today to go through everything. So come to the South by talk, get a book, or when it comes out on March 11th. But one of the main things is that guests are a critical component of this. And they are part of it. It's not like Aristotle's where they're not even in the model. And I'll let you imagine and dream a little bit about how these forces, matter, space time, what might be in there. But not for too long, because what I want to get to the second point of what I think is really important, because as we start to look at interactivity and say, okay, maybe here's a model that we can do with interactivity, we still have to address the fact that people experience stories, and the Freytag's pyramid and the 3-act structure work, right? Especially in the Western cultures. But why do they work? There's actually been a ton of studies lately, maybe in the last like 2 decades, especially from neuroscientists like Paul J. Zak, who wrote a book called Immersion, which is fantastic, and studying the neuroscience of story. So rather than thinking about story as a series of events, a plot, and the plot being the soul of the story, I propose a concept called relative linearity, which says that the guests are the relative framework for a structural narrative, meaning stories work because they work with our neurological structures. If neuroscience, if you're not familiar, studies brains, our nervous system, like how those function and interact. And when you start diving into neuroscience, there's a lot of evidence to support that the structure of Freytag's pyramid works because that's the way our brains work. Our brains seek patterns. Our brains seek familiarity. The way that we release oxytocin and dopamine is relative to crisis and catharsis. It's not that the plot sequence is working, it's that it is in tune with how we are structured as storytelling animals. There's a book called Storytelling Animals, but like as storytelling creatures, that if we put those plot points relative to us, rather than relative to something that's out there that has been being presented to us, and we know where we are in real time in the dramatic structure, and we are delivering dynamic content to the guest in that interactive narrative, then we know that they've gone through the climax part and they are hitting the bottom of the falling action, and it's time for our familiar pattern of denouement or resolution to be kicked in, and we're delivering content relative to where they are in the arc, relative, rather than positioning them relative to the content. Flips it, right? And that means wherever they move, wherever they go, whatever they choose, that content in a smart dynamic system adjusts with them. It's a lot. All right, so how do we bring this back into reality? Because a lot of it is very theoretical at this point. There's a lot that I've tried to build. There's a lot that I have built in terms of like what the systems and the structures are, and the AI architectures that help track that, and the models on the neuroscience side, so that we can figure out the delta between the existing content and the content that needs to be presented. All of that aside, hey, we're in the real world. How do we really think about this? So the amazing thing about science and story, even though we talked about Aristotle, here's physics, here's poetics, like they were, similar things. And then science takes a deep dive in one direction, story takes a deep dive in the other direction. They separate. They don't, like, God is no longer evolved. Thunder is not created by Zeus. And now, as we get into quantum and things that are so hard to discover, scientists use stories to explain their phenomena. They use things like thought experiments, right? Not anything that you would necessarily quantify, but something that can represent the complex equations in a way that our minds can wrap around them. And this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to create this rather than like a linear function, something that is a holistic solution. So as we look at that, I'd like to throw out a thought experiment for you guys as to how this might practically work. I'll give the context of a gaming engine. If you're familiar with gaming engines, way back before gaming engines existed, every game developer had to develop their own engine. And the reason that we have amazing things like Unreal and Unity right now is we have an engine that takes care of all the, all of the collision detection and the particle systems and everything, so that we can focus on the creative, right? And we can layer on, and we can make so many different types of games with that core engine. Now, imagine if there was a narrative engine that took care of all of the things that we're talking about, the nuances of structure and story and themes and interactivity and neuroscience. And on top of that, you can just layer your experience that you want to create and let people interact and engage with. So let's imagine that we're in a narrative engine where anything is possible in this game engine. And here's a thought experiment: the adaptive prop. You go into the space. There's a chair. Every person in this Zoom right now might choose to do something different with that chair. One might look at it and examine it from a distance. Somebody else might sit on it, see how it fits for size, right? Somebody else might just ignore it and keep walking on. If the system knows what that interaction is and the level of interaction and is able to say, okay, maybe if they looked at it, it's something we bring back as an artifact. Maybe if they sit on it, this is something that they've really connected with, and that can become a much more key narrative device later in another scene. It's that the role of that chair is dependent on where you are in the story and what your interactivity is. As long as we know where you are in that story, we can bring it in a relevant way to the narrative so that it amplifies the meaning and makes it even bigger and more powerful, but within the context of a narrative story and engaging. So that chair's function and significance are not predetermined, right? They are not preset by the author, by the creative team, and endowed with meaning by them. They're shaped. Its role is shaped by the choice and the focus of the guests. Just food for thought. This is just skimming the surface, and I want to make sure that there's lots of times for questions. I'm sure that some of what I left out will be brought up as questions, but if you're not going to be in Austin, quantumnarratives.com is where you can sign up, and when the book launches or there are announcements and things in other places, I'll keep you in touch with it. So thank you, Josh.
All right, Stephanie, thanks so much. I find this super interesting, and and like challenging also. Like I feel like I'm back in my undergrad in some ways. It's like but I'm sure people have if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. Otherwise, I can sort of we'd started having some conversations about this, before the session. It's really interesting because are there any examples of quantum narrative happening, or things that sort of suggest quantum narrative happening right now, or is this something that's that hasn't quite this sort of storytelling hasn't sort of formalized yet or expressed yet?
Right. I think that there are a lot of things that need to come together for this larger vision to be actualized, right? There is right now the research and a lot of the things that have been done in the realm of gaming and research at universities, which is probably why you feel like you're back in school, just because that's where a lot of the stuff is coming from, but they're still approaching it from plot and character centricity. There have been a couple of games recently, maybe not so recent, like Papers, Please, where it's not about the plot or the character, but it's about theme. And and it leans into what gamers call emergent storytelling, meaning the meaning emerges as you interact with things. But even emergent storytelling lacks that kind of structured linear narrative that we as humans are so compelled towards. So it's still about bringing those things together. And I think the purpose of putting quantum narratives out before I have every single equation figured out or everything solved is to open the doors and to invite discussion, invite problem solving, and say there are things neuroscientists and ludologists and ludonarratives and media studies and critical literary theory can contribute to this, that can make it more powerful rather than just it bouncing around in my head for whatever. So it's really an invitation for everyone to join the conversation so that we can have really exciting, a new domain of story.
I love it. So Mark has a question, which I don't know if it's a joke, but it's actually, I think there's something kind of to it. Mark, do you want to ask your question? He says, are we
Sure.
experiencing a quantum? Oh, I'm sorry. Go on. I'm sorry.
I was just thinking of it in context. I was wondering if we're experiencing a quantum narrative in politics right now. I just actually read an article this morning by Ben Davis on ArtNet about the state of art.
Oh.
That's pretty good. I can put it in the post. It's quite fascinating. I'm in LA and Freeze is starting this week, and I'm curious if these themes will be showing up some frequency. But anyways, it was just a fun comment.
No, it's true. I mean, if you know Feynman on the physics side, he said if you want to talk about nature and reality, you have to talk about it in terms of quantum, right? Because quantum is the probability of things and the influence of things and how we influence each other and what we are influenced by. And you can't think about it in terms of like Newtonian physics because that's all preset. And so, in essence, not just this political climate right now, and the all of it is relative to story. It's just a matter of using the neurological learnings in order to create a heightened reality, right? Like we don't just want to create another reality and like now we're living in an alternate universe and whatever, or you know today both sides politically think everybody's living in an alternate reality. It's so strange. But I do think that what we want to do is elevate that narrative and elevate that story. So those moments that we love so much about being able to extract meaning and reflection and see ourselves in, and we grow and we learn from stories, like that still needs to be a part of it. It's not just about the interactivity being present or reflecting pure nature.
It's funny because I think when we first talked about this, I was thinking about this in terms of like Sleep No More, but like now I'm thinking about it more in terms of like QAnon. And like in some ways, like I remember like Scott Galloway having this whole thing about like the fear of like an AI powered QAnon, and like to me that almost feels like a quantum narrative, something that can adapt to your usage and create a compelling story for you.
Well, I'll take the fear out of it, and I'll tell you how I look at this on like that bird's eye macro view.
Yeah.
And this is really important. And I cut down to the principles of it just for the sake of time. But what is really, really important to me is what happens when you have a 5-act structure and a hero's journey where everything is about crisis, everything is about catharsis. There is you have a main character, and that main character is going through crisis, and everything is about them, and the rest of the world is just tertiary, subsidiary. They're irrelevant to this one character that we're following, and our mirror neurons are firing against that one character, and we're saying, yeah, that's like me, that's like me. That puts us at the center of the universe. Aristotle's Poetics put us at the center of the universe. He believed that. He put the earth at the center of the universe. And by backing this out and saying, you know what? It's not one person's crisis. It's not one person's catharsis. All of us interact together and affect each other and the environment that we're in. Like, my dream is that we evolve narrative to the point where stories lead the way, stories lead science, stories lead us into paths. And if our stories can support us being part of a bigger world and not just consumed by our own egos and our own problems, then we can make the world a better place with this.
I love it. I love it. I mean, there's probably a rabbit hole to go around determinism and, you know, God and all that, but like I'll let someone else ask a question. Zipperin, is that how I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Do you want to ask your question?
Hi, hello. Yes, you pronounced it well. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi.
First of all, I love the concept and experiential and Sleep No More or Life and Trust has been working on this for a while. And I truly believe that guests will surprise you when they go to your event or where they partake in an interactive theatrical experience. And so how do agencies or design firms or creative people, how do we take that and implement that into our flow to allow for the guest to have control or a sense of control? Maybe it's a fake sense of control, but how do we implement quantum narratives into that pipeline?
I don't know that quantum, I mean, I still have to think about the application of this, right? Like I'm still like my head's just wrapped around it. But what I would say is what's fascinating with starting to look outside of the guest, of the story, of the plot, and looking at patterns, looking at people as neurological experiences, stories as neurological experiences, is that there is a ton of research in the behavioral sciences and behavioral psychology. What you think is random is a lot less random than you think it is, right? Like even mountains, when you think about mountains, you look at a mountain and it's like complex. How did this all go together? There are fractal theories that can mathematically calculate those mountain ranges. Like we think everything is so complex and are like, and this is what we've been trapped in, this soft science of what do people feel and everything along those lines. But if we back us out and we say, okay, maybe this isn't just about feeling, but maybe this is about patterns and tapping into those patterns and leveraging those patterns so that we can create a more powerful experience or a more powerful story. Like what are those patterns, which I dig into a little bit as well. So I don't know that this is the thing that applies. I just encourage it, creativity, especially when you're building with clients and brands, which I've done a lot with Refinery 29 and very, very big brands where they're trying to hit ROIs and they want to know what the impact of that installation is that you did. And we're doing it with these bias surveys that say, that was great, I give it a 5. Like that's how we're able to quantify people's reactions to it. And I think as technology progresses and gets more ubiquitous and more cheap, honestly, and more ecosystem based, which is a lot of what I saw at CES, that those ecosystems are able to talk to each other and you don't just have like, this is Android, this is iOS. We'll be able to be in a space where you don't have to sit there and go, okay, wait, can I do X to achieve Y within the creative space and kind of look back to the behavioral thing. So I know you're looking for a much more probably real world right now, walking into a client's room, what can I do? I think if you back it out and just say, this is amazing, but this is what people respond to. And we have data on that. Data, that's the reason people have ROIs with something that's emotional, right? They need to ladder those numbers up to somebody to get the numbers back out to pay for it. Sorry, Zipper. Did I just
No. That's actually a really good insight because pattern and identifying those is the reasoning behind the emotional connection. So love that. Thank you.
Great. Lucas has a question. I can ask it if you like. I always give him a few seconds to find the unmute button. All right, I'll ask it. Where's this conversation happening? What Discord groups, blog, or thought leaders are you following?
In my head. And
okay.
Some of the few of you who are on this call that I have floated concepts to and been like, okay, but I'm thinking about it like this over probably like a decade, and bounce things around. And again, it's like I needed to feel good about the foundation of it in order to open it up to where it is now. And like, let's start a Discord channel. You start the Discord channel. I want to find somebody at a university that has a lab that's like, let's spin this up, let's do this research, let's build the stuff that I don't have the time, right, or or the manpower or woman power to build right now. So like, let's explore. It's an
All
invitation.
right. Well, I'm launching the Future Spaces Slack channel, so we can Slack. So maybe we can create a channel in there. So and certainly find some opportunity for the conversation to keep going. Dab, you had a question?
My question was really, I was just, and you kind of already answered this. And as I try to grapple with it, first of all, I'm loving it. And you just got started. I wanted to go so much deeper. Next time we need like 3 hours for this one, not just one. But I'm just kind of curious, like what has like gotten you on this journey? Where do you want to go? Where do you want to get? Like, what's the point? What's driving you? And because
Yeah.
that might help me to understand like your journey a little bit better.
Sure. Yeah, I jumped right into it, right? Um, it I went into Carnegie Mellon as a theater major that was studying drama and directing specifically. So very, broad themes, a lot of Aristotle, a lot of text analysis, script analysis. Um, and I ran into somebody who was like, "Hey, here's a thing called email," and I'm like, "I don't know what email is. I'm not using email." Um, and oh, by the way, here's a VR headset, and I'm like, "Oh, this is fucking amazing. This is amazing." So I doubled at Carnegie Mellon simultaneously in drama and in computer science. So I think starting with that point where it was happening at the same time in real time for me, um, everything just fired off. And the narrative paradox thing has been a question on both sides, right? Like the storytellers are like, yeah, I want interactivity, but like like branching narrative, it's so obvious, and Bandersnatch is predictable. And then the gaming side is like, we want lots of interactivity, but the open world, it's really hard to layer in. As soon as we start layering it in, gamers want more interactivity. So I'm hearing it from both sides and just grappling with it in my mind for so long that it's like, and of course, all of the fantastic research that's been done at Georgia Tech, at Carnegie Mellon, at UVA, USC, like there's a ton of research where people, but so I started looking at all of that, and then I started backing out saying, like, these are brilliant people. What's the fucking what? Like, why can't we figure this out? And I think once you start, and then once you start looking back, and you go, well, what are the big assumptions? Like, what are things that we are taking to be true that we haven't questioned, right? And then you have to start there and go, oh my god, oh, every single one of these is working on plot or on plot, character, because those computer scientists are dependent on the story people, and the story people are still working in linear. So the linear people aren't thinking about interactivity when they're thinking about plot and character, right? Like we hadn't cross pollinated those yet, really. We've just kind of been like, how does each work? Where does this all go? Like I said, blue sky, a better world. Um, I would love to see more multidisciplinary artists where there, and with a project that I have right now, there are a lighting designer, classical theater lighting designer that codes in Python, set designer who is absolutely brilliant and also creates her own award-winning VR experiences. Like this kind of multidisciplinary where we don't have to know everything about coding. I certainly don't, especially since coding has progressed so much, but I know enough about the core fundamentals and the basics so that I can speak with a coder. And I've been literally the last 3 days heads down in Devland, working on an AI beta, and like they're the coders. But I would love to see this multidisciplinary going back to story and science not being completely separated, and us coming together and saying, maybe models from over here work, maybe things from over here work. How can we create better stories that are part of where the content is going with increased interactivity and increased computational power?
All right, we have so many messages here. Like we might have to do another session at some point. Just we'll do a follow up just because there's so much. And I'm gonna just totally skip the line and ask and throw something in there. Because you'd mentioned, you've done things that are like theater, you've done things in Walt Disney Imagineering, things that are embodied like physically, and then you've also done things in like VR and sort of more digital spaces. Where do you think these quantum narratives are going to manifest first, and like where are you most excited to see them manifest? Like the digital or the physical, or the both, or maybe is XR? I don't know. What do you see?
Yeah, I mean, as much as I would love to say it would be in location-based entertainment and in theater, I think there's a uh, limited knowledge set and limited investment scope. And I think more and more, as much as I love creativity, I'm realizing money does run the world to some degree. And where you're seeing investment and where you have more scalability and where you have more flexibility is not in the physical world. It's in the digital realm. So I imagine that it is going to be happening more in the virtual space.
Yeah,
And if we can break this dependency on Aristotelian poetics and say, okay, we've got, here's a different model, go play around with it for the people that are more in the computational science. And then we bring in the passion, everything that artists know intuitively and instinctively when they're creating their pieces of work, and bring those together. Um, I personally would love a hybrid. I want hybrid. That's what I'm working towards, like real
yeah.
world things that are happening. Meaning is overlaid, like, but heightened. But I think it's starting digital. So
Yeah, it sounds like sort of like almost like the game engine for the metaverse or something, like something like that. Drew, I had a question.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much, Stephanie. This is amazing. I have actually a more centralized version of the question I put in the chat now after hearing you talk, which I think is just around how you feel um, within these kind of quantum narratives, how you see creators maybe having a sense of like what they want to say, or like a vision, or like what is the idea of kind of like communicating, if there is something very strong a creator wants to communicate, how that can interface with these sort of quantum narratives, or like how those two roles intertwine in your mind.
yeah, Drew, great question. Because, and one of the things I skipped over for brevity in this chat is how the nature of certain things change, right? When you're working in a different domain. So the nature of authorship, for example, will change critically, right? A lot of the work that the authors do behind closed doors, page after page, as they throw it into the wastebasket and hone in on what that is, that creative process, and then they get to the message and they're like, I want to convey this. This is what's important. Um, the nature of authorship then backs out to being something that's more of a systems designer, right? What they are doing in their head, as far as like, you know what, I need to tell a good versus, I want to show good versus evil, and I want to show, and I want it to be in a Western, and it's in an impoverished like planet on the third moon of Jupiter. And like, they do that all in their brain. And I'm saying we're going to need, if we can get those brilliant story minds to like come out and say, it's uncomfortable, but and also if the engineers give them the tools to say, okay, all of that internal process, let's put those into play in a system that will play out with the themes in a more powerful way, potentially, than even you just putting it on a stage and them watching it, because they're going to live it and they're going to experience, and it's the same theme and it's the same, structure and everything, but now it's theirs and it's reflected back on them, and it's incorporating their choices with the same power of a narrative structure. So the nature of authorship changes, and I think that's going to be a huge resistance point to entering this new domain, and a critical one.
I love it. All right, now this sounds like Westworld. I love it. Anne has a question.
Hello, this has been great. I would be curious to have you speak a little bit more about the balance that you've found throughout the course of projects in terms of context versus agency. And I know that's sort of at the core of this narrative paradox. And specifically, maybe you can shed some light into, you had guests there, but in terms of physics, there are these measurable forces, right, in terms of matter and energy and time and space. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about what you found as like the core elements and whether you really see those as in terms of like measurable agents within an environment, or what kinds of, other than guest data, what's the other, like, oh, floor foot, the way I think about narrative in terms of like modular narrative in that patterned way of a sporting event where you can gain a lot of the type of a team that a soccer team is by how many miles they're actually running, or like how many touches something has before it gets into the goal. So yeah, I'm wondering in terms of like, what are your measurable data points in that narrative universe? And then how do you consider context versus agency?
Tell me what you mean by context, because I don't totally.
Sure, like what are the rules of engagement, whether that's like in something like Sleep No More, oh, this is the end of the world, or in something like any other video game where it's like, oh yeah, that's a solid wall, that's a NPC,
Right.
You see
Yeah.
the UI of how many hearts do you have left, what level are you in, you can zoom out to see where you are in the map, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, these are huge questions. Like there's so
Totally.
much
Yeah.
in this, right? I will say that onboarding and the role of pattern recognition and things along those lines have been solidified in the linear world, right? Even back to the days of Shakespeare, when they would put a yellow flag up for a history play, certain color flags up in order to pre-context you before you go in. I know I'm supposed to laugh. I know I'm supposed to have this kind of response. Gaming is very, very good at those subliminal contexts, right? Like, and as our designers, in terms of what type of font you're doing, what speed things are moving at, everything, the opening credits of things preface our context of how we interact. And we know that when we go into a theater, we're going to sit down, we're going to watch something, and it's going to come. So, we're not going to be interacting with it. I think there's a lot to be discovered in terms of how we define what the context is, because everybody wants to use it differently. Whether you're in games or straight narrative or a hybrid of both. There's certainly a lot of stuff in ARGs and LARPs, and where you have, and I think that this is actually interesting too, where a lot of the early research into believable agents and interactive stories used like a game master model that is used like a dungeon master in Dungeons and Dragons, and so that you have one point of person that's cohering whatever crazy shit people come up with, because we know that it's probably going to be crazy and we can't account for every probability, right? So there's a master brain that's saying, okay, here's how we're going to move it along. I don't know the answer to it. I think that the answer will depend on the context in which it's used or what the purpose of it is. But all very good questions.
All right. I think we have this feels like a very deep rabbit hole. I feel like we're not going to get all the way down today. I think we probably have time for one more question. Scott had a question.
Can we save the chat thing? I haven't been able to.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah,
I'll send you
like what questions are in the chat. I'm so curious.
Yeah, and we could also totally find the time to like reconvene, whatever makes sense. But I think Scott, yeah, with 35 new messages down below this, so this rabbit hole keeps going. Scott, did you want to ask your question?
Which one was it?
So let's have the one. Another good question is how these stories are shaped by creators. Well, actually, you know what, Scott? Dealer's choice, or whatever you want. No, the opposite of that. You choose. What do you want to
Yeah,
ask?
that's an interesting thing of like the creators versus systems that we're creating to tell those stories. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about, is what is worth consuming as we create these different systems, right? So as you're saying, talking about the change of authorship, then how do we start valuing the stories that we're creating through these systems we create? And I think that's a really interesting concept of what does art mean anymore, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I agree. There are lots of questions will come up.
Okay. All right, should we get one more then? Okay, so let's see. All right. Lucas asked a question. Okay, now I'm scrolling through. All right. All right. This is actually, it looks like there's just been a very, very sort of detailed conversation. It's like a conversation going on here. Oh my gosh. I have to
I love it.
All right. All Here we go. Eric Alba, you want to ask your question?
Eric.
Oh, what's up, Riggs?
Hey, man. Good to see you.
Hey, I mean, it's more like a note. I like as soon as you started talking about it, I was thinking of very ARG like things, and I when you started talking about physics and stuff, I started thinking about the Heisenberg effect, and like I started thinking about observer effect and how that, like how in immersive theater, let's just use Sleep No More as the example, which is maybe not the best, but the fact that you're there, they have to the performers have to the environment and the performers have to account for you
Yes.
being there, thus changing the story theoretically. And with enough dynamic content, and this is the first thing I thought about was there's no way, like physical will never keep up with digital when it comes to quantum narrative because it moves faster and it doesn't obey physics. Most of the time, it doesn't have gravity, doesn't have weight, doesn't perish. And so ARGs is where I think combined with the physical thing. So if you can like if you looked at like the old ARGs of the past, like the Beast, the AI film, like the Beast, like which is mostly online, and then Dark Knight and stuff like that. But if you threw that into a city, but you had to also use stuff digitally, mobile, combined with physical scavenger hunt's not the right word, but those kind of things, and knowing that any person that contributes could affect the story randomly and switch it, so all of a sudden everybody gets a text, you know? And now there's like telephonic experiences now, right? So now people are starting to go back into Discords and chats and just playing games in there. So that some game master can just be like, everybody gets to go here now. It's like Pokemon Go, actually. Pokemon Go is like that,
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
pretty
I mean,
wild.
and there's a lot of like, I mean, Pokemon Go kind of disperses, right? And then that's much more emergent. Like it's what you're layering onto it. I do think that what is important to me in the back of my mind as I think through all this is that it's not just a one person experience, right? I think story is more powerful when you're experiencing it with people. But sure, you hit that button. And so it's, there's an aggregate moment where one person's in the exposition of their story, and this is what's kicking off their story, and somebody else, this is the climax, and they're all seeing the same thing with different contexts. But because we're able to dynamically deliver audio, if once the glasses are here, all kinds of like contents, it allows us to shift that, so you don't have to have a DM. And that's like
Yeah, actually, I just started as I said, Pokemon Go, which is one of the best executed data acquisition kind of models ever. But I started thinking about I don't know if there's any San Francisco people here. When I used to live in San Francisco, I can't remember if it was last Friday or whatever, when critical mass happens in San Francisco, it's a total fucking shit show, but it's rad because it basically there's only one rule. You start at market or whatever, and then people just go. And it's like a flocking system, where a flocking system is like you can't tell who the leader is, but they're all starting to like they're just doing things. Same with the critical mass. And I think stories can do that, especially if you lean on digital, because you can move at the speed of a text or whatever, and I think it's exciting. This is a great talk. It's really like
Yeah.
blowing up my mind a little bit.
And Stephanie, you had also mentioned the AI in this as well. Like what happens when the game master is AI? I think that's also really interesting.
And I think that we as storytellers and creators, like it's not just in the system's control, right? If we're sitting back and let's say the authors come in and the system designers come in and it's like, I want to create a story where greed is wrong and there's, here are the, opposing forces and these are the fields that the cultural fields that work within this, and people come in and they experience it in different ways. Like we're going to be learning about us, about ourselves, and about our stories. It should be reciprocal. It shouldn't just be like, oh shit, now what? It's not linear anymore. You're not just putting it on a page and there you go. Like let's evolve ourselves with this. So.
All right. Well, we are at time. So Stephanie, I guess are there I will convene and we'll figure out how to follow up on this properly. I'll make sure to get you all the unanswered questions and get you the whole thread. Is there anything that you sort of like to sign off with today to sort of signal to the audience here?
Just how grateful I am to be here with you all. And this is the first time these words are coming out of my mouth about this quantum narratives, and to be able to share it with you and with such a group of, I'm brilliant people. Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks so much. Tomorrow we're hosting a workshop. Next week we're hosting another one of these. We'll figure out a way to follow up meaningfully to this conversation. Stephanie, many, many thanks for being here today. This is super, super inspiring. Lots to think about and process. Have a wonderful day. If you're in LA, come out Monday too. It'll be a fun one. All right. See y'all.
Thank you. Bye.